Thank you for joining me today for a presentation on understanding mold in the library and archival collections. We'll learn about mold and take a look at how to prevent, identify, and respond to mold following health and safety guidelines and protocols established by collections care professionals. This slideshow is based on information published and made widely available from the field of conservation as it pertains to managing collections in archives, libraries, and museums. Mold is part of the fungi kingdom, meaning it is a spore-producing organism feeding on organic matter. The kinds of mold that we will address in this presentation are already familiar to you. The mold that grows on oranges or bread, the fuzzy mold that appears on almost everything in the wet, hot conditions that we frequently experience here in New Orleans. These kinds of mold are Conidia fungi, a type of fungus that grows a reproductive structure called a conidia. The spores of these molds are ubiquitous and are in the air and on most surfaces waiting for optimum conditions to bloom. Molds are an important part of the natural world as decomposers. They are often the bio part of biodegradation. For their very ability to break down solid matter into smaller components, they are an ever-present danger to archival and library materials, and a challenge for staff to prevent and control. Another factor that makes mold challenging to deal with is its ubiquity. Its spores, which are reproductive cells, are always around us in the air and on most surfaces. Although molds are always around us, they are only noticeable and start causing issues when they grow as a colony. This slide shows the life cycle of one single spore, but a patch of mold is actually a complex structure of a colony called a mycelium. This part of the mold structure is generally on or under the surface of the object, but becomes visible during the asexual reproductive process as the structure called a conidia grows to release spores. That's the fuzzy part of a mold colony that we see during active mold outbreaks. Mold spores can lay dormant for long periods of time until optimum conditions allow them to germinate. Although there are some kinds of mold that can germinate in extreme conditions, the kinds of mold that we experience in the library and archives world prefer humid, warm, stuffy, and dark conditions. In as little as 2 days of high humidity, meaning greater than 60% RH or relative humidity, and with temperatures over 72 degrees Fahrenheit, mold spores can germinate and bloom into a large outbreak. Mold also likes a slightly acidic medium for growth, which makes the acidic papers and binding materials found in archival and library collections a perfect target. Again, given the proper conditions, mold spores can germinate, so taking preventative actions to mitigate the presence of mold and mold growth is the best approach to creating a safe environment for long-term collections care. Fighting mold outbreaks in an archive is difficult, time-consuming, and expensive. This is another case where the best defense is a good offense, which means preventing mold before it can germinate and become an outbreak. First, we want to prevent as much mold as possible from coming into our collection spaces. We do this by pre-screening incoming materials before they arrive. Generally, we ask our donors where materials were stored and what they were exposed to. Frequently, materials have been kept in attics, garages, or basements, or the ground level that we call a basement here in New Orleans. Sometimes we are able to do a field survey of material in situ, such as at the donor's house, office, or storage unit, before accepting it on campus. We also screen collections when they arrive. Collections cannot be taken into the stacks until we have done an assessment at intake, looking for active mold, evidence of inactive mold, and dirt and dust that may contain mold spores. We monitor the environment of our collection storage spaces in order to prevent mold spores that are already in the air and on surfaces from blooming. Collection storage guidelines suggest keeping storage areas at a moderate temperature, below 72 degrees Fahrenheit, and below 60% relative humidity. This is difficult in our particular case because Jones Hall is an older building, and the HVAC system is designed for human comfort instead of long-term preservation of library and archival materials. In such cases, it is better to create as much environmental stability as possible and to understand the particular characteristics of the building, the HVAC system's capacity itself, and known problem areas or consistent issues. We use PEM2 data loggers, as seen here from the Image Permanence Institute, to record the temperature and relative humidity. The monitors are placed on every level of collections storage in Tusk, and the data is collected and collated on a regular basis. It is important to leave the data loggers exactly where they are so that we can collect data that is consistent as possible. We partner with campus facility services to properly maintain the HVAC system and assist in response when conditions stray far from recommended set points. Other measures for mold prevention include regularly scheduled dusting, cleaning, and collection checks. Archives should also look at airflow within their stacks and make sure to improve airflow near any pockets of uncirculated air. We had a mold outbreak here on stacks level 4 in 2022 due to a pocket of cold air that created condensation and then caused mold to grow as it came in contact with an area of stagnant warmer air. I'll talk more about this mold discovery incident at Tusk later in this presentation. Every person will have a different response to mold exposure, ranging from minimal to extreme. That response depends on length of exposure and pre-existing health conditions that might include things like asthma, allergies, or other immunocompromising conditions. So although some people might have a reaction to mold or find their reaction to mold exacerbated by these other health conditions, the kinds of mold we encounter in the archives are not usually dangerous. It's not the kind of mold that might infect a person, nor at the level of growth like you might see related to big water emergencies, like a flood-damaged home. The Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, guidance about mold exposure is based on a variety of factors, since mold varies so much in type, levels of exposure, and each individual's reaction. OSHA regulates use of personal protective equipment, or PPE, for people working with a significant amount of mold on a regular basis. For significant outbreaks, we call a vendor who specializes in mold remediation and whose staff is trained to adhere to such regulations. In Tusk, when a small amount of mold is identified or suspected on an item or a small amount of material, we follow similar protocols to OSHA. These protocols include wearing appropriate face masks, disposable gloves, and, depending on the amount of material affected, disposable aprons and washable goggles. We want to follow PPE protocols for a couple of reasons. One, we want to minimize any personal exposure or reactions to mold as much as we can. And two, we want to make sure that we're not introducing mold spores to other collection spaces and material. There are a variety of characteristics that help us identify mold on archival materials. The mold that we find on archival materials might be active or inactive. That is to say, the mold we find on library and archive materials might be actively reproducing and growing, or it might be in an inactive phase waiting for appropriate conditions to bloom. Let's take a look at the list of characteristics for active and inactive molds. With active mold, you would see fuzzy, defined structures. It must be rendered inactive by freezing before it can be cleaned from materials. Inactive mold will be dry and powdery and can be easily removed with a soft bristle brush into a HEPA filter vacuum. The smear test can help you differentiate between active and inactive mold. Use a gloved finger to smear the suspected mold. If it is active, it will have a shiny, wet smear. Inactive mold smears with a feeling of very fine powder and no shine. Here's an example of inactive mold. As you can see, there is a tide line that indicates water damage at some point in the past. This is an indicator that you should inspect the item further. You can see mold staining, meaning mold has bloomed in the past and left behind spores in the fibers of the end papers, which are waiting for opportune conditions to activate bloom again. The box and book cover in these pictures has an active mold bloom. You can see the white, fuzzy appearance of the Conidia structures. These images are from a recent mold outbreak in Tusk. Here's a look at a mold outbreak on the shelves. As you can see, mold will easily spread from item to item and might require a large-scale response depending on how many shelves are affected. This is another example of active mold from a Tusk mold incident. As you can see, the appearance of mold can vary greatly from item to item. Here is an item with mold on the interior cover boards of a book. You can see the tide lines of the water damage and the resulting mold growth. Mold will attack many different kinds of materials, including acetate film as shown here. The gelatin binder of photographic film is an especially good nutrient for mold. If your film is exhibiting white or brown patches, or if you see a lattice-like growth on the edges of the film, you are most likely viewing mold. If mold has eaten into the emulsion, the film will be noticeably and irreparably damaged, exhibiting feathery-like distortions or dull spots on the projected image. Areas and objects affected by mold often produce a musty smell, and we can see that mold growth comes in a variety of colors and shapes. These characteristics depend on the substrate, paper for example, that the active spores are consuming. While a musty odor or certain odor isn't a reliable way to identify a specific mold species, it should signal a need for further examination of the area. Some of the variation that we see in mold types can depend on external environmental factors, and identifying specific types of mold should be left up to the mycologists. Foxing is a different kind of staining that we see frequently in archival collections. It is not considered a preservation concern, and it is very difficult for preservationists to remove, so it's usually left alone. There are many theories about what causes it, but a prevalent theory is that it's the oxidization of impurities in the paper. Discovery of mold, whether it is on a single item or a large-scale outbreak, requires immediate action and falls into emergency response protocols. Everyone that works with collections must be trained on these procedures. When we identify small-scale outbreaks or inactive mold on single items, it is important to isolate the item immediately to prevent the spread of spores. We must also isolate any adjacent items to the moldy item, as well as dispose of the archival housing that it was found in. To do this, take the following steps. 1. Isolate the item and any adjacent items in a sealed plastic bag. 2. Label the bag with an adhesive label indicating the collection identifier or call number. And 3. Inform your supervisor or any member of the collection management team. You can also immediately alert your supervisor to take the necessary action. Once the item is bagged and tagged, environmental control settings should be checked to make sure that any localized high humidity or temperature can be dealt with. Large-scale outbreaks require the isolation of the moldy materials in a safe, quarantined location, or, while the items remain on the shelf, in a sealed, sectioned-off area. A mycologist or mold remediation company will be contacted to begin mold remediation. Moldy items are sent to a conservation lab where they can be treated by brushing off inactive mold with a variable speed HEPA vacuum and fume hood system, or, if this equipment is not available, where the mold can be brushed off outdoors. Freezing in the case of active mold is the best way to deactivate the spores before they can be vacuumed off, but freezing does not kill the mold. Killing mold is very difficult and usually requires forces that might damage archival materials, like extreme heat or caustic chemicals. Although it is key to isolate moldy items in plastic bags to transport them, we don't want to leave them in these enclosures for long term. They can create microenvironments that might allow for further mold growth. Any items, such as boxes, folders, or other enclosures and used PPE, must be disposed of immediately in sealed trash bags. After disposing of your PPE and any equipment that might have been contaminated during the removal process, make sure to thoroughly wash your hands with soap and water to remove mold spores and any mold-produced toxins. Also, be sure to wipe down the shelving with a light solution of water and isopropyl alcohol. Here are some mold response don'ts. Number 1. We do not use things like Thymol or Lysol in the stacks or around archival materials. Make sure to only use approved cleaning products for mold remediation on the objects and in the affected area. 2. Always remember to use your PPE when handling mold, even if you only suspect that you've encountered it. 3. Keep the environment in mind. Never raise the heat, it only promotes mold growth. And finally, always respond to mold. Tell collection management team staff immediately if you suspect mold on archival materials or in the stacks. Thank you for joining us. We can work together to prevent mold outbreaks by maintaining and monitoring our environment, following acquisition protocols, and following the protocols we've discussed today to respond to mold. There's a lot of great resources available for mold response in the archival context. You can check out our other Tusk training materials or the resources linked in this presentation. Thanks for reviewing mold safety, response, and prevention with us today.